heat tolerance. We talked about a lot of the acute effects over the last week. Cardiovascular effects, metabolic effects, some other endocrine effects, the perceptual effects. Overall, being too hot limits performance for a variety of reasons. So is it possible, after looking at pacing and seeing that we can modify our final core temperature when we fatigue, it seems like it's adaptable. Can we adapt to heat? Can we modify our ability to tolerate heat? So the research in this area is, I guess, still sort of new. It's a burgeoning area. There's a lot of research coming out recently. I'm not going into depth about the mechanics of modifying heat tolerance. We'll talk about the overall effect. But it's also important to be cautious of confusing the effects of heat tolerance with the effects of fitness. Fitness and heat tolerance are very different things, and in general, the characteristics we observe that change as you become more fit parallel the characteristics that change when you become more tolerant of the heat. They're often very similar. So a more fit individual will have a larger blood volume. An individual that trains in the heat or becomes more heat tolerant will also have a larger blood volume. It's hard to know if this is due to fitness or heat. Now, a lot of the work in this area will take individuals that either are or are not fit and then control for fitness and expose them to the heat, so any change in blood volume will be due to whatever the intervention is. But they both exhibit larger blood volume. They both exhibit a reduced blood pressure. So individuals with a higher fitness have a reduced sympathetic activity at a given workload. So lower heart rate at rest. Generally a lower systolic blood pressure at rest. There's a whole host of benefits that if we have lower values at rest, our reserve is greater. The ability to turn those systems on is greater. And so it's clear that for fitness, it's better to have a reduced or some of these lower values at rest to allow more potential to tap into heart rate, stroke volume, or the ability to ventilate during exercise. More fit individuals tend to store more glycogen. Now this also, this is one that doesn't parallel changes in the heat so much. If you train in the heat and become more heat tolerant, you don't necessarily just store more glycogen, although it does affect how you use it. Fit individuals store more glycogen to be able to do more work. In the heat, that has the added beneficial side effect of having a greater reservoir of glucose to be used in the heat. We saw that was one of the things that was accelerated. Heat sped the breakdown of glucose coming from glycogen. So storing more is good, potentially owing to how or why fit individuals exhibit a lower critical core temperature. Some of these things allow them to just be better in the heat if they're not specifically trained to be in the heat. There's some debate on whether just heat exposure will affect mitochondrial content. Certainly it'll be lower than an individual that trains and taxes the energetic requirements of the muscle, increasing mitochondrial volume or mitochondrial number. One of the hallmark changes, the adaptations to exercise training, endurance exercise training. And while this allows us to produce fewer reactive oxygen species or free radicals, negative signals at the muscle, it also just helps us rely more on oxidative phosphorylation. More fit individuals have a greater capacity for aerobic respiration and might be able to hold off on that switch to fast twitch muscles or the increased reliance on anaerobic glycolysis. So a few divergent effects here that are evident in fit individuals, not in heat-trained individuals per se. But both exhibit a greater sweat sensitivity and lower core temperature. So both seem to respond to the repeated thermal stress of either exercise or of heat exposure by having some adaptations that reduce core temperature at rest, that allow an increased sweat sensitivity. So if this goes up, we have a greater increase in sweat to try to dissipate that heat. And we'll talk about some of those mechanisms today. We've already talked about some of the mechanisms, larger blood volume and the lower blood pressure that we talked about last week. But we'll add to this today. Now, if you were to sum up the directions for acclimation in one or two sentences, they would look like this. To acclimatize to the heat, it requires being put under a thermal stress, a heat stress, not necessarily an exercise stress, but it requires that your core temperature increases by 1 or 2 degrees, and not just acutely, a blip or an error in time, but it has to be a sustained increase in core temperature for at least an hour. And we can use passive heating like saunas or hot water immersion to accomplish these goals. Hot tubs, fantastic way to do this. If you have a Finnish background, you know what saunas can do to help with this as well. But this is not unlike the response that you'll see to simply exercise training. As you exercise and get hot, your core temperature goes up for persistent longer periods of time. So there's certainly crossover if you just end up exercise training. Here, these are recommendations for only heat exposure, sitting quietly in the heat. It's perhaps not surprising that since there is overlap, a lot of the adaptations that we observe are similar to the adaptations of improving fitness. Increased blood volume, lower blood pressure, reduced core temperature. And I thought it was really interesting to throw up a figure like this that takes the idea of heat acclimation and the benefits of heat stress to the extreme. This is a 30-year retrospective study by a good Finnish group of authors looking at sauna frequency, so passive heat exposure, the average number of times per week, and the cumulative hazard ratio, or the hazard incidence. This is the likelihood of suffering a severe cardiac event resulting in death at follow-up. So the higher the number, the higher the line, the worse it is. The greater the incidence of sudden cardiac death. The lower the line, the lower the incidence of sudden cardiac death. And they observe this pretty nice trend when correcting for fitness level, age, lifestyle, etc. The frequency of sauna exposure seemed to relate to a reduced incidence of sudden cardiac death. So kind of interesting to take this out to the extreme, and I'm not sure of anyone that would do 4 to 7 sauna exposures per day. Maybe that if you're lucky you'll get 1 to 2 a month if you go to the gym and sit in the sauna for a little while. But certainly there seems to be some benefit, although we don't know from this what the benefit is. Some benefit of heat exposure, but what specifically changes with this repeated heat exposure that allows this reduced incidence of sudden cardiac death. One guy that I actually know at the University of Oregon is doing some work based on this study, looking at healthy college-age men and women that come into the sauna and do heat exposure for 8 days. What are the changes that occur acutely that might be borne out over 30 years in reducing sudden cardiac death. Arteries, more compliant, more flexible. They respond a lot more quickly to changes in blood pressure. Blood pressure is lower after 8 days. You go and do 8 days of sauna exposure, lower blood pressure, more sensitive arteries. And then a measure they like to make is the carotid intima media thickness, so essentially the thickness of the wall, thickness of the arterial wall, which doesn't mean a whole lot for us right now until you consider that that area, thickening of that area usually implies atherosclerosis, development of plaques in the arteries. They see an improvement, a reduction in that as well. So overall fitness and health of the arterial vasculature seems to be improved in only 8 days, which may help reduce sudden cardiac death long term. Is the sauna working here, by the way? Yeah, I remember a couple years ago it had broken, and then it was on all the time in that room in 209. It's always on, and it filters up through the floor, so it gets really hot in that room exclusively. Okay. Yeah, so go ahead, head out, have a sauna. Now, I think it's important to understand pattern of acclimation, the acclimation benefits, when considering the potential for our mainstream and other news sources to spin out stories like this, the surprising benefits of training in the heat, which I'm not going to disagree with. There certainly are surprising benefits. They might not be better than altitude training, maybe, but it's really hard to compare those two things. This is getting a little old now. It's 2 years old, but at first glance, seems like a really nice article. Generally a reputable source. Outside Online has a pretty big following. And then you read into the article a little bit, and it starts off pretty benign. Improving tolerance over time, gradual exposures, workout in the heat, a little bit every day. Fantastic, that's great advice. The second way to adapt is through thermotolerance. I've never heard of that word before. That's not a term that we use, but thermotolerance, tolerating thermal stress. I get it, they're putting some buzzwords together. A cellular adaptation to an extreme heat experience, like suffering such severe dehydration after a run that you need an IV. So, intravenous saline injection, obviously. Now, we probably know better, but the average reader of Outside Online might be thinking, oh, okay, so this is something that I should do to push the boundaries, get my extra 2-3% on my PB time, or beat out the other competitors. Maybe I want to have this extreme heat experience, and if I don't need an IV after exercise, I'm not exercising hard enough. So maybe I need to step up my heat stress game. That's probably a foolish recommendation. And Corey Stringer that we talked about last week is the epitome of how foolish that, sorry, not foolish, but how extreme the consequences can be. Let's take a look at some work on heat tolerance, how much of a benefit there actually is to heat acclimation, at least in terms of whole body exercise performance. Now these, actually this fellow, Chris Minson, is the guy at Oregon that I was talking about that's doing that acute heat exposure study. Mike Saka is he's at the U.S. Army Research Institute, does a ton of work with dehydration and heat stress. And these authors looked at training in 13 versus 38 degree environments for 10 days. So arguably a cool environment, not neutral, 13 degrees, versus the heat, 38 degrees, certainly very hot. And what we're looking at here are two different groups, a control group that just exercised in a normal environment, didn't do any heat or thermotolerance type activity, and then the heat acclimation group that exercised in the heat, and their individual responses after 10 days, their tolerance to heat, their tolerance to cold. So tolerance to heat are the closed circles, tolerance to cold are the open circles. Both of these groups did both of these performance tests before and after the acclimation protocol. Now, as far as performance goes, there's nothing really new or exciting here. It's not a time trial. It's just a measure of VO2 max, aerobic capacity, which is a pretty good gold standard cardiorespiratory measure to make. And if you check out these lines down the middle of the graph, they are the line of identity where if the dot falls exactly on this line, your performance post-training is exactly the same as your performance pre-training. So being on the line means nothing really happened. Being above the line signifies an improvement after the acclimation protocol. Being below the line indicates there is some reduced performance. And that's not the case. No one's really below the line ever, which is good. There's a couple individuals, but that's within normal fluctuation of measuring VO2 max. The large majority of the control group did as well 10 days out with normal training as they did pre-acclimation or pre-control trial. No benefits of just passive control. But the heat acclimation group improved aerobic capacity, their ability to tolerate both heat stress and to improve performance in cool environments for the most part. There's a general pushing up of all of these dots above this line of identity. So there's some benefit of this mild, I'll say mild heat training exposure, but at most it's maybe 5 mils per kilogram per minute, 10 mils in some extreme cases from 45 mils per kilogram per minute to about 55. It's a pretty big difference over 10 days. But arguably not a large change, and what we're missing here are changes in body weight too. So if you're training in the heat, are you sweating a lot? Is your body weight lower? And does that mean your relative VO2 max is artificially increased? If I weigh 80 kilograms to start and then 75 kilograms later, my fitness is the same, relative VO2 max will have gone up just because of that loss of body weight. So we don't have that here necessarily. Anyways, a general trend towards there being benefits for heat acclimation, and in trying to figure out why the fairly obvious difference between these two groups is the wide changes in plasma volume. Meant to approximate blood volume, but we see this expansion that we talked about, 6% more blood volume or plasma volume in the heat acclimated group, 5% less blood volume in the control group for whatever reason, but a 10% difference overall between the two groups. And plasma doesn't do anything as far as oxygen carrying capacity. Hemoglobin carries oxygen. Plasma is just the fluid that supports hemoglobin in the blood. And it seems hemoglobin doesn't really change. But what we want to look at is the hematocrit number. Hematocrit is the percentage of whole blood that is red blood cells. So 43% of whole blood is red blood cells. 42% of whole blood is red blood cells. These numbers are pretty stable, which they should be. But 43% of a smaller number and 43% of a larger blood volume means there's an overall expanded oxygen carrying capacity in the heat acclimation group. So some pretty interesting findings, but not nearly as extreme as might be alluded to by the idea of thermotolerance, needing an IV, suffering severe heat dehydration in the heat. Certainly some hyperbole being used to get viewers in that case. So in brief, there is some benefit of heat adaptation, but it's not nearly as large as might be reported. You can modify heat acutely through exposure to heat or heat due to exercise, but heat acclimation or heat tolerance also changes with maturation. So this is something that is not fixed throughout the lifespan. It's generally lower on the extremes. Children seem to be less heat tolerant, and elderly adults seem to be less heat tolerant as well. Whereas somehow, somewhere in the middle, healthy adults have developed the optimal ability to withstand or thermoregulate. So children generally have a greater volume to surface area ratio, which essentially means that they think of them almost as shorter or rounder. They pack more things into a smaller volume or a smaller space, which means that it's harder for any heat to get from the core inside to the periphery. It's essentially a smaller insulated area to work with versus fully developed adults that have longer legs, longer arms, have grown taller, have a lower volume to surface area ratio. So the access to the skin is a lot easier in normal adults. This essentially just means they accrue heat faster in the heat or during exercise. They get hotter quicker. And to complicate things, they can't thermoregulate as well. Kids store heat faster, and they don't lose heat as easily. They don't sweat nearly as quickly. They don't sweat nearly as much. So the sweat response is blunted. It doesn't turn on as early. It doesn't turn on as high. And their drive to drink, which we'll see coming up in the next chapter, is smaller, is lower than a developed adult. They don't have that desire to ingest fluid as early. They don't want to drink as much, and that complicates this accelerated heat gain in younger children. So maturation, these responses haven't fully developed yet, and maybe it's because they haven't had enough time to experience that repeated stress. They're certainly generally quite active, or at least have been in past years, but these are things that need to develop over time. So it's, I won't say easy, but that makes logical sense. These responses develop in children. They haven't had time to develop, and so they're compromised. It's harder to understand why the elderly are less thermotolerant than normal developed adults. And to the best of our abilities, we've ruled out aging per se. So the age of a tissue doesn't seem to affect the ability to thermoregulate as much. But it's difficult to study because the elderly adopt many behavioral patterns that are different from us as developed adults. They're generally slower. They don't engage in as much exercise. They have medication that they take as well, which might affect heart rate, blood pressure, the ability to send blood to the periphery. Muscle wasting is a large problem, so sarcopenia, not so much dynapenia, the loss of strength, but muscle wasting would impact the generation of heat. So there are a whole host of things that complicate our ability to understand heat balance and heat load in the elderly. But it's generally a consensus that aging is not necessarily a problem. It's probably these confounding factors that make them more susceptible to the heat. And there's some things, did we talk about them? I've talked about them in recent years, but they also seem to have this confounded thirst mechanism, a reduced sensitivity to wanting to drink fluids that is also exhibited in children. I think we get back to that in the dehydration section. So some responses compromised on the extremes that complicate heat load due to maturation, not necessarily due to heat exposure or heat training, but that are just natural biological variations. So we exercise and we get hot. We exercise in the heat, we get hotter. We get too hot, we listed all of the things that can go wrong, and all of those things will impact performance. They'll cause fatigue. You are now experts on that, having done your first concept map, trying to combine those factors and how they influence fatigue. If we're in that situation repeatedly or long term, we can adjust our thermotolerance somewhat. We can see improvements in our ability to tolerate the heat. But what can we do, not in adaptation, either at the muscle or cardiovascular level, but sort of at the external technological level working inwards? What other tricks can we use as smart humans to prevent excessive rises in core temperature, mitigate hyperthermia, and prolong performance? What cooling strategies can we use either during exercise, here after exercise, or you can also think of this as in preparation for the next exercise bout? And in preparation for the next exercise bout is probably the obvious first place to start. This is an area that was pioneered by the Aussies in the 2004 Olympics, where they showed up with these ice vests, these cooling vests that have now become rather commonplace in the Olympics and rather high-level sport. The idea being that if you can pre-cool, the reserve is increased. The same way that having a lower heart rate allows you to increase it more before you reach your maximum, if you have a lower starting core temperature, you can gain more heat. It can increase more before you reach that critical threshold. So doing this pre-cooling routine increases the total possible heat storage that you can experience with exercise. This either allows you to exercise longer, accrue more heat, or maybe will influence pacing so that you can exercise faster or harder or at a higher level. Have a larger positive heat balance, according to the heat balance equation. Maybe your exercise lasts the same amount of time, but you run faster in that time because you're accruing heat at a greater rate from this lower core temperature brought on by these cooling vests. The complement to this idea is pre-exercise slushies now, ice slushies. Instead of cooling from the outside, cooling from the inside. And some companies have even gone so far as to develop sports drink slushies. So like an icy sports drink that has some sugar, some salt in it, in anticipation of the fact that you will be exercising. Both of them meant to achieve the same outcome or a similar outcome. Now, during exercise, our options are rather limited. And there aren't many good examples that I can discuss for cooling strategies to mitigate heat during exercise. You can take off heavy clothing or equipment, but if your sport requires it, like hockey, you can't really do that. Football, can't really do that. You could try to ingest one of those slushy drinks, but if you are waiting for rest stations along the course during a marathon, they might not have them. You don't know how much time is between rest stations during a marathon. So there's a lot of things that can impact your ability to actively cool during exercise, or we're limited in things other than the body's normal responses during exercise. This is an image of one of the water-perfused suits that NASA uses to keep astronauts cool out on spacewalks. Massive heat stress, especially when you're faced with solar radiation direct from the sun that's not reflected off the atmosphere. Huge heat stress that is mitigated by these suits. And you can see some of the hoses in here. There's this network of hoses that are filled with cool water, and they pump generally over the entire body, but you can adjust these individual valves to send more water to the torso or more water to the legs. And I don't actually know about many of the advances specifically in this area. They probably use solenoids now, and they probably have individual temperature sensors throughout the fabric that auto-regulate delivery of this fluid. But overall, this is cumbersome. Sure, we can deliver cold water to the rest of the body, but this is not something you'd probably elect to wear while exercising, during a marathon, for instance. Not very aerodynamic if you want to have a cycling time trial personal best. So there's limited research from a sport perspective because the equipment is so cumbersome, and it's also very expensive. Not generally an appropriate strategy for cooling during exercise. One thing that might work well is not so much using external technology, but in the idea of intermittent cooling, taking breaks where within those breaks we can accelerate cooling. And maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe during these breaks you could put on an ice vest. Or depending how long the breaks are, if it's intermission between 2 periods of a hockey game, you could jump in an ice tub. Or if it's between shifts during an ice hockey game, you can't really do too much by taking off equipment. Maybe you can take your helmet off if you're protected on the bench. But there might be a role for intermittent cooling in helping to speed heat loss during exercise. Now, I only say this because during some of my doctoral work, and I showed you the performance data at the start of this section, or not the start, in the middle when we were looking at teleo anticipation, how everyone waited till the end and then that performance went way up. This is a trace during the third period where performance went way up, not of performance but of temperature. So during each of those sprints, and then here in the 10th sprint, they had saved all of their pacing for the end, and they were outperforming their first sprint ever. I'm also recording core temperature the entire time, looking at these 3 different trials. And so if I overlay where the sprints were, the green box was a little warm-up phase, and then we had a sprint with a break in between. Sprint with a break in between, sprint with a break, and so on. This ended up being a surrogate for intermittent cooling. And I think it's really borne out nicely on this top line, the no fluid dehydrated line. And it sort of seems like with every sprint, you're doing a lot of work, contracting the muscles, getting really hot. When this is done, you see a nice little blip or an increase in temperature. Increase, 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 increase. And this could either be interpreted as intermittent exercise makes you hotter, or intermittent exercise allows you to register this hotter temperature as heat is being distributed to the body and dissipated by the environment. This is a really interesting idea, something that I've yet to explore a bit further in the lab, but something that I want to look at a bit more in coming years. Do you get blood flow to the skin and back? Does this help cool someone more than constant exercise? Can you use intermittent cooling to speed decrease in core temp? Right now it's mostly speculation. What's not speculation, though, which is kind of cool, is this potential strategy from some guys at Stanford University. This is not something you would use during exercise, but in recovery from or between, during a small break between bouts. Seems to be fairly robust and productive. Rather than just waiting for blood to get to a place where it can be cooled, this device is making it go somewhere where it can be cooled. And hands, feet, face, like the fellow said, have really extensive vascular networks. You have generally a high degree of dexterity, and they are important tissues, so lots of blood flow, lots of opportunity then to cool the blood if you can get blood into those networks. Now during exercise, they're not often in those networks, so that's why the negative pressure helps to pull blood during rest to those networks. The question would be, could you use something like that during exercise, and would it work? Probably not, unless you have a battery pack and a vacuum and you don't need your hand for anything. And then you're also questioning, is blood flow allowed to go to the hand if you're running? We're really good at diverting blood where it needs to go to support the muscle that is working. We clamp down any other vascular beds that don't work. So is the hand allowed to see blood if blood flow is required at the legs primarily during exercise? We're not sure. But between bouts, during rest, this does seem to be a pretty robust and effective treatment. So this is a compilation of data, and you might have noticed the last guy's name, Gran, I'm not sure, but biologist at Stanford. This is one of his papers. So this is data using cooling and subatmospheric pressure. These black squares are the cooling glove that we just looked at. This is a published paper on that work. Versus cooling only with no pressure, so cooling at the hand only. And then some individuals that did control, cooling only, cooling with reduced pressure. And what we're looking at here is exercise time, so it's not bench press, it's not pull-ups. I didn't find any information on that and compare it to steroid studies. I really question that claim. But judging by some of the changes shown here, where with the treatment versus control, again, line of identity, if you're on this line, there's no difference. If you're above this line, then the treatment improved performance. If you're below, then the control saw higher performance. Everyone's above the line. The treatment always worked, and it worked to varying degrees. So cooling only in the white squares worked a little bit. Cooling in subatmospheric pressure seemed to work a bit more. There's a bit more dispersion above this line of identity. And then the subjects that did the 3 trials, the treatment trials, saw a much higher improvement during the exercise with the combined treatment than in control. And in some individuals, if you look at these numbers, it's almost a doubling of the time to exhaustion in the heat. 40 minutes initially, and then with cooling, somewhere in the 70-minute range. Pretty impressive. So not everyone did all 3 groups, control, cooling, and pressure. But if we take out the individuals that did all 3 and try to get a sense of the stepwise changes in exercise duration, we see that cooling did have an effect. There was a greater tolerance to exercise in the heat, but only of a few minutes, still significant. Whereas cooling plus this subatomic pressure blew those results out of the water, almost a doubling of performance when using that cooling plus subatomic pressure strategy. At least in these 6 subjects, they all seem to respond fairly well. Not even big error bars. This is a pretty consistent stepwise increase. And so the question then is, why is there such a big difference between these 3 groups? What's going on during the recovery, during the treatment period that allows exercise to be so much higher? It seems as though core temperature is at the heart of this idea. Core temperature, thermal load, and what we might call cardiovascular strain. So these are the same subjects that did all 3 groups. We're looking at cooling only with the triangles. No cooling is the squares. It was really hard to find a place to put that label in, but no cooling, just a control value is the square data. And then cooling with the glove and that suction, closed circles. And you can see this is in the exercise, this is the exercise either during control or post-treatment. Core temperature was lower, heart rate was lower at almost all time points, allowing a greater performance in that cooling plus suction group. So lower temperature, here esophageal temperature, not rectal, but we saw that those generally parallel, and a lower heart rate indicating perhaps a lower cardiovascular strain, which makes sense if you think about it, because if you're so much cooler, you don't have to worry about sending blood to the muscle and sending blood to the skin. You can hold off a little bit, heart rate can be somewhat blunted, and then eventually as you begin to heat up and require that cooling, heart rate increases and we see a similar maximum heart rate, similar maximum core temperature. It just happens further out. So some pretty interesting mitigation strategies, but again, not anything that you really use during exercise. Can't take this glove with you. Can't wear a water-perfused suit. Might be able to use a water slushy kind of mix, but hard to get access or carry it with you. Keep it cold. Mostly this is in recovery from or in preparation for exercise. With some really nice robust findings. So, long-winded look at heat stress and some other factors today. Let's summarize what we learned in this section. There's probably some critical temperature that limits performance. There's consistent thresholds where people will voluntarily stop exercising, and those are different in trained individuals versus sedentary individuals, but they're consistent within those groups. So it's likely temperature is a critical variable that's being monitored, being sensed, that we try to control, and if it's outside of our control, it initiates slowdown. It causes fatigue. Those potential mechanisms we saw all build and deteriorate with a reduced venous return, with a higher heart rate and a reduced stroke volume, reduced cardiac output. We see this cardiovascular insufficiency with an increased reliance on type 2 muscle fibers or on anaerobic glycolysis and increased carbohydrate use. We see a reduced muscular efficiency. All of these things seem to accelerate fatigue, and then there's inflammation, and then there's endocrine responses, the perception of effort goes up, pacing goes down, overall performance is reduced in response to a heat stress. With such a wide myriad of factors, it's hard to know which is the operative factor that triggers fatigue. It's probably not likely that there is one factor, but it's the culmination of all of them. And it's likely that it's driven by core temperature specifically. Whatever the critical organs are, a critical organ temperature or a composite of body temperature is likely to drive these physiological changes. And then skin temperature, or an assessment of the gradient between the body and the environment, will modify those responses. If skin temperature and core temperature are similar, indicating very little gradient and a reduced likelihood to offload heat, well then the alarm bells are probably a lot louder than in a case where skin temperature is low, it's cold outside, but you're really hot internally. That gets to the idea of heat flow versus heat or temperature per se. And I thought one of the last points to throw up, the idea of pacing, the idea of perception, and the idea that you can modify tolerance to the heat through mental variables not related to physiology, not related to metabolism, or not related to performance is pretty interesting. The cognitive aspect of thermotolerance is something we're starting to explore now, but the perception of exercise always seems to be higher in the heat. Voluntary performance suffers as a consequence. We can modify that through things like motivational self-talk like we saw, or we can see decreases in the perception of effort if we help cool the body. with those other mitigating strategies that we talked about. So too much heat, definitely bad. We'll take a quick break, but I want you to think about this as you leave and throughout the day. If getting hot is bad, if getting too hot is really bad, and if getting too hot causes fatigue, why do we ever even let body temperature go up? There's lag time between an increase in body temperature with exercise and then when sweating turns on. We wait a little bit. We wait until the body gets hot before we start to sweat. Why do we ever allow that to happen? Why wouldn't, as soon as I got up and started jogging down the hall, why wouldn't I just turn sweating on immediately to the maximum to prevent body temperature from going up? Why do we let body temperature go up at all? Why is there a delay? Let's take a quick 3-4 minute break. Get up, stretch your legs, go to the bathroom. We'll come back. We'll look at dehydration, which is really this framed in a slightly different way. So a lot of the usual suspects coming up.